The views and opinions of this broadcast do not reflect the views and opinions of Armed Media, UNU Productions and its affiliates. Enjoy the show.
Teflon Pan Man. I'm the Teflon Pan Man. Ain't nothing gonna stick on me.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. A very good evening. I am Rob Rosenthal, your host. Welcome to All You Can Eat, a show about, well, you know, the kind of things that we love to consume. All things related to food and drink, and that's predominantly what we cover here. There's no politics or anything like that, but we can spread the love around a little bit because a couple of notes from today. First of all, this is podcast number 11 coming to you live, as I said, from New York City, where it is still a balmy 82 degrees. Just a stunning day, and I was fortunate enough to spend a little bit of time today in Central Park, which I want to tell you about. But before I do, hang in, because I'm blessed tonight to have a guest on the podcast, a woman by the name of Veronica Chambers. Now, when I say that Veronica Chambers is a prolific author, here's what I mean by prolific. Last week, for example, Ivy Manning was with me, and Ivy has written 7 cookbooks. The 8th is coming out, and to me that's prolific, right? Because I'm a guy that has 1 cookbook in the can. Ivy has done 8, so I'm thinking that's prolific. And then there's Veronica Chambers, prolific. I don't think that I know the exact number of books. We'll talk about that when we get her on. But I know that it's more than 21, and it could be as many as 31. And I will also say, and even though I will repeat this later, that a whole bunch of those, 4 or 5 of those, are New York Times bestsellers. And Veronica has also collaborated with people in the food space, if you will. And I'm talking about super chefs, Marcus Samuelsson, with whom she wrote 2 books, one of which was a memoir, and another one with the great and talented Eric Repair. So we're going to come to, so when I say, I'm just, again, we're talking about prolific, just a lot of books that I want to talk to Veronica about. And before I do, I just want to throw this in. Again, even though we do kind of focus on food and eating and cooking and that kind of thing, it's fair to delve into some other subjects. And here's a true story from today in Central Park, because I pop over there on a beautiful day. I figure I'll get a little exercise in. And somewhere along the way, in the middle of the park, I stopped to stretch, and I'm looking out over kind of a balcony. And I see a policeman on a scooter. When I say a scooter, I mean it's not like the New York City Police Department is springing for Vespers, but it's like that. It's a scooter, and he's scooting through a pedestrian mall area, so you don't see any real vehicles there at all, including bicycles. But he very quickly scoots with no lights, nor with any sound, to a place where 2 young African-American young men are hanging out. Now, this is the kind of scene, honestly, that I'm watching with a little bit of a side eye, because on some level, you know, you want to see it, but you don't want to necessarily be conspicuous in your witnessing of the scene. And the policeman pulls up on his scooter, and it's clearly a surprise entrance. Like, nobody is expecting it. You don't know that he's coming. He just shows up, and he pulls up right next to these 2 young black males. And from my vantage point, and I'm probably, let's say, 150 feet away, I'm guessing that they would be in the age range of, let's say, 18 to 24 from where I am. And they're they begin a conversation, not even animated. I think he got off the scooter, and there's two guys. He has a conversation with one that looks to me to last about 3 or 4 minutes, at which point the officer and the young guy that he's talking to shake hands. But which is a great sign, but it's not the end of the interaction, because they walk together, I would say 50 or 60 feet, where then the young guy reaches into a pair of pants that he had left on the park bench, and he hands the policeman his ID. And the policeman at that point looks at the ID and literally writes a ticket and hands it to the kid. Right? And that's the end of the interaction. He handed him a ticket. Now, I would be remiss not to at least, I can't tell you for sure what the infraction was, because there wasn't a lot of noise, there wasn't a lot of any kind of commotion, there was no obvious kind of thing that, since there was the smell of marijuana, it's entirely conceivable that he pulled up when one of them was smoking a joint. That's like and again, you can't hold me to it, I don't know it for a fact, but it's like the most almost the most seemingly kind of obvious reason. Anyway, he writes a ticket, he hands it over, and that's the end of their exchange. Except for one thing, I'm watching every minute of that, and I'm thinking to myself that in so many places in this country, that same type of event ends badly, and sometimes very, very badly. But not today, and not in New York City, where I'm not going to tell you that the police have been perfect. There have been abuses here in this city as well. But I will say that we're fortunate to have what is arguably the finest police force in the country. And you can look up the statistics. These men and women of the NYPD keep New York the safest big city in America. So that's a little exchange from today. I'm feeling a little New York pride. I will tell anybody who's not from here, and I know that you can listen to this from anywhere in the world, that I think last year was a record for tourism in New York City. It is not only safe, but at this time of year, it's stunning. And I will also tell you that the Central Park, New York, 840 acres of magnificence, it's peak season right now. It was stunning out there. The park is in brilliant condition. It is unbelievably well taken care of. It is super safe. And that's my story for you today, May the 2nd, 2018, all you can eat. And now let me introduce to you the one and only Veronica Chambers. You heard me say before that she is a prolific author. Best known for her critically acclaimed memoir called Mama's Girl, which was adopted by hundreds of high schools and colleges throughout the country, and co-authored the award-winning memoir Yes Chef, which she did with Marcus Samuelsson, as well as another book from Marcus, a memoir, Make It Messy. And she's collaborated on 4 New York Times bestsellers, although Veronica may correct me, and it could be 5 by now, including recently 32 Yolks, which she co-wrote with Eric Repair. And not only, in addition to all the book writing, she's been a senior editor at the New York Times Magazine, at Newsweek, at Glamour. Born in Panama, raised in Brooklyn. I can't tell you, Veronica, how excited I am, overjoyed, actually, to have you here with me, and welcome to the show. Veronica, are you there? Let's do that one more time. It's funny how that works. It doesn't work. Okay, there you go. Did you miss that whole introduction, by the way?
No, I heard the introduction and then I got disconnected. I don't know what happened.
Okay, not a problem. You're back on. And no podcast of mine is complete, Veronica, without some massive technical screw-up. Just FYI. So it's not you, it's me.
I'm glad to do my part.
Thank you for being here. I really appreciate it, and I am excited to speak to you.
Thanks, me too.
Now, you were born in Panama, and I know you didn't spend a lot of time there. You were probably there for what, like the first 18 months of your life?
Yep, and then we moved to England, and then we moved to Brooklyn.
Do you? I don't mean for this. It almost sounds to me like kind of an ignorant question, but can you remember anything from the first 18 months of your life? Is there anything from Panama that resides in your memory?
Well, I think, like a lot of first-generation Americans, I grew up in kind of a Panama of my house. So,
Okay.
so Panama was very vivid in my childhood because it was my parents' point of reference. It was the sort of home away from home. And so I think in some ways, when I went back to Panama in my 20s, it was like I grew up in an older Panama than people who grew up there at the same time.
When you went back, though, I guess it felt very familiar to you.
It did in some ways. I think it did, just because I think when you grow up in a family, and my whole extended family came, so my grandparents and my aunts and my uncles and cousins. So I grew up in a community where Panama was a big point of reference. So it was very, the hills were alive with Panama.
I gotcha. Now, what age are you at when you hit Brooklyn?
I was 5 when I arrived in Brooklyn.
All right, so most of your childhood experience is from Brooklyn.
Yes.
And the Brooklyn that you grew up in, how would you say that it's different from the Brooklyn of today?
I think that the Brooklyn I grew up in was different because it was sort of New York before the Renaissance of New York. So, but at the same time, one of the things that I'm really proudest of is that my first book, Mama's Girl, is taught as a companion piece to A Tree Grows in Brooklyn in New York City public schools.
Right.
And that means a lot to me because I always knew Brooklyn was a special place. I always had a lot of Brooklyn pride. Ed Koch was the mayor. Shirley Chisholm was my congresswoman.
Right.
As challenging as things were in the 80s in Brooklyn, I think that there were also these real beacons of what it meant to be from New York, both in literature and film and in Congress. And so I always had a lot of Brooklyn pride.
Was Mama's Girl your first, or just the first that was kind of critically acclaimed and recognized?
It was the first book that I wrote on my own. The very, very first book that I wrote before that was a book I wrote with John Singleton about his second movie, Poetic Justice. It was his follow-up to Boys in the Hood, and it starred Tupac Shakur and Janet Jackson. It was kind of a behind-the-scenes making of a movie book. And so Mama's Girl was sort of my debut in that it was my first book on my own. And
tell people what's the story behind Mama's Girl?
Mama's Girl is really about two things. I think it's about growing up first generation American in Brooklyn, but it was also about growing up with my brother and me making really different choices. I went to college at 16. My brother dropped out of high school at 16. And so it's kind of, in a lot of ways, I think the first thing that kind of really connected that book to a broader audience was a question of resilience.
Right.
And how do you have two kids who grew up in really different circumstances make vastly different choices? And even though I wasn't conscious of that, I was 22 when I wrote it. So, but in some ways, I think that's what's been one of the resounding themes of the book.
How did you come to writing? Just at first, what was it that turned you on to doing that?
Well, I was one of the first people in my family to go to college, so I didn't really have the idea of writing as a career. But oddly enough, partly because I spoke Spanish, I had all these different campus jobs, and one of my campus jobs was tutoring in Spanish, and one of the young women that I tutored wrote for teen magazines like 17 and YM, and so she kind of got me into writing, and so it was really a question of just happening to have met the right person at the tutoring center.
Oh, so as far as writing goes, what is the kind of best? Is there some best advice that you got about writing at some point?
it's interesting. I think that the very best advice I got about writing was really from Julia Cameron's The Artist's Way. I just think that book was seminal to me. But, now that I teach writing, I feel like a lot of what I learned along the way was, half of it is figuring it out, half of it is having great editors, and it's a combination, I think, of the two, and then having some sort of stick-to-itiveness of it that helps you kind of craft a career.
Well, and from your history, the figuring it out part is really your kind of like superpower, if you will. From my perspective, because you've not only been prolific. Do you happen to know the number, like how many books your name is on at this point?
I think that I have a couple of books coming out in the fall, and so I think at the end of this year it'll be 30 books. 30
books now. And here's the amazing part for me. It's not only, which really defines prolific. It's not only that you've done 30 books. I could probably find James Patterson and John le Carré. It's just that all of their books are like of a single kind of genre. Your book, you've written children's books. You've written about musicians. I want to talk to you about Celia Cruz because she's top of my list. You've written these books with the chefs. It's not only that you've been prolific, you cover such a wide-ranging diversity of subjects. That's really kind of amazing, but I think speaks to your skill to figure things out. Am I right about that?
Well, that's very kind of you to say. I think it speaks to a lot of curiosity. It was funny. Eric Appert posted something the other day on Instagram, and he goes, "I'm what happens when OCD meets ADHD," and I feel like that's, me. It's that mix of like completely obsessive and a little bit short attention span, and so I like the mix. I like doing a little bit of everything.
I can relate to that because I have put for at least however many years I've had whatever kind of social media account, and I'm pretty sure it's Twitter I'm referring to here. I put myself in as a variety junkie, that I actually get off on the new things. I can relate to that. But what are you? I guess what I want to ask you about is kind of when it comes to book writing, is there a particular process? Are you disciplined? Is it like I wake up in the morning and write for an hour? Like, what's your process to get to put things out at the rate and level that you do?
I think it's a process that I've developed, partly out of my own work. And like you said, it's when you've done anything for this amount of times, it becomes a little bit like the Malcolm Gladwell 10,000 hours. You got to figure some things out.
Right.
But I also think that for me it's been a mix of really trying to say, okay, I'm going to try to put things out. I'm going to try to get that first draft out relatively quickly. But I'm going to commit to as many revisions as my editor and publishing house and my collaborators will allow. And I think that thing that Anne Lamott talks about, that, committing to the sort of, excuse my language, shitty first draft,
right,
is the biggest hurdle of all, because I think, I teach writing, and what I see a lot is a lot of protecting.
Right.
We want to protect, we want to be perfect, we want to wait until we're worthy. And I think that having talked to a lot of really amazing writers, like, that's not really the way it's done. It's like you have to just, obviously there's different levels of trying to reach for excellence, but your brain can do so many numbers on you about what's good enough that you have to move that out of the way in a big way.
Is fear ultimately kind of like the great blockage?
I think fear is, that idea of self-worth. It's interesting to me, having collaborated and written books with a number of fairly well-known people, that the same thing that beginning writers say to me is the same thing that celebrities say, which is, why does anyone care? Like, we all have this fear that there's just too much out there, and why does anyone care? And yet, I still believe, and I think a lot of people believe this, I don't think this is unique to me, that storytelling is such a primary and powerful unit of communication that you don't have to tell the story the first time or the best way or the most original way or the most unique way. I don't think that's how stories are judged. I think it's really that idea of putting the story you have to tell really badly out and it connecting to the readers for whom it's meaningful. I think it's that simple. It's like calling up a friend and then having the perfect thing to say to you. I think that's what we feel when we connect with a book that we love.
Yeah. You tell stories, yours and other people's. And since you mentioned the celebrity thing, I will make the point that you've written books, not only with the chefs, which I'm going to get to you with in a minute, but with Michael Strahan, with Robin Roberts. Are they different? Are celebrities, do you think, other than their kind of recognition, are they different as human beings from everyone else?
That's an interesting question. I think obviously that life experience feels different. I think that one of the things that happens with celebrities, and when I talk about like working with celebrities, they're also just people that I didn't write books with, but I had meetings with or consultations with or whatever. So I'm sort of drawing on a broader base than the people whose names are directly attached to me. Sure. I think the thing that happens with celebrities is that as much, like, for example, I don't remember 60% of the people that I went to high school with. Right. A celebrity doesn't remember 10% of the people that they went to high school with, and 10% of the people that they met in 2008, and 2% of the people they met in 2016. There's just the volume is so high that it becomes really hard for them to connect with the memories and the people because things are coming at them in such a bigger way. So I think that's the challenging thing is that they just have a lot coming at them, and in some ways there's this weird thing of, is this something that happened to me, or is this something that like 8,000 people tweeted about that I remember because it got a lot on Twitter? Like it becomes your memories and the public memories become really mixed. And I think there's a challenge to like finding the true story and finding the path. And often like interviewing people around them is the best way to get back to, oh yeah, I remember that really mattered to me. Yeah. Because it's just a lot in their brain. And I think it's really hard to kind of carve truth and story out of that.
I will say to you that aside from food, one of my other kind of favorite subjects and passions is music. And if I had a top 10 list, and I probably do somewhere, or multiple ones, I'll tell you who shows up on it, and it's not, you wouldn't necessarily associate this with me, but Celia Cruz shows up on my list. Like, La Vida es un Carnaval for me is like, that's always on my top 10 list. And in fact, I don't know if it won't work, so I'm not even going to bother playing the button. But like, what made you write about Celia Cruz?
Well, growing up in the United States, and being a Black Latina, I remember there were just a lot of people, Latin and otherwise, who were always kind of questioning my credibility from a very young age. And my mom always said, like, the fact is Latinos come in all different colors. Look at Celia Cruz. And so I really grew up with her, not just with her music, but with an image of someone who was so in the culture. And I was really lucky. I was at Newsweek and I was starting to write about Latin music, and I got to interview her before she died. And it was interesting because we did the interview in Spanish, and I had fought so hard to kind of keep up my Spanish. Not everyone in my family or my neighborhood or all Latinos in the U.S. have. And I just remember that moment where they said, okay, Celia Cruz had some time. Can you come over and interview her? There's no translator. Can you do it in Spanish? And I was like, yes, I can. Si se puede.
Right. That's pretty funny. And how did it go?
It was amazing. It was funny because my mom was sending me all these texts, and she's like, I want you to tell her, she said this in Spanish, but sounds even crazier than it does in English. She goes, I want you to tell her that I gave you milk, but she was the nourishment. And I was like, I'm not going to talk about your breast milk with Sally Cruz. It's like I have a very limited time. But I did tell her how much, she meant to both me and my mom. And what I did is, I did a picture book about her, which we love. And it's funny, my editor and I were talking about it. We were like, we love that book. It is one of our favorite projects of all our projects. And I actually, you don't always make a lot of money on books, as you probably know.
Well, I know too well.
But what I did is my husband and I actually endowed a Celia Cruz scholarship at my alma mater, which is Bard College at Simon's Rock. And one of my favorite things every year is when I get the letter from the person who's gotten the Celia Cruz scholarship. And I will say that out of the 10, 12 years we've done it, that almost all of them say, I had no idea who Celia Cruz was, and I got the scholarship, and then I looked her up. And I remember being a Du Bois scholar, a W.E.B. Du Bois scholar, at 16, and not knowing who he was, but thinking, I just got a lot of money in this man's name, I've got to look him up. So the fact that at least, in the school in New England, there's like a steady train of music students who are studying Celia Cruz, who know that some part of their education is being paid for in her honor, really makes me happy.
Yeah, that's good and impressive work. It reminds me to take a 1 minute break here and tell people that if they want to find you, the easiest way, I'm going to guess, is veronicachambers.com.
Yes.
And they can also probably find you if they're social media savvy. What's your favorite handle there in social media?
I'm on both Twitter and Instagram as at VV Chambers.
At V.
Double V's.
Double V Chambers.
Yes.
So you write the Celia Cruz, Queen of Salsa book, and literally I only listened to La Vida es un Carnaval 3 times today in your honor.
Thank you.
What was the first? So the first book you wrote that was kind of food related was, I'm going to assume, the first one you did with Marcus Samuelsson.
Well, actually, before that, I was an editor at Glamour.
Okay.
And I top edited the food pages, and so I actually wrote the Glamour cookbook, 100 Recipes Every Woman Should Know, which has this very famous recipe about engagement chicken, which is kind of a long story, but it's a very famous recipe in the Glamour magazine history.
Well, is it worth my asking? Kind of what ingredients go into engagement chicken?
So engagement chicken is basically a roast chicken that one of the editors started sharing with the staff, and the crazy thing is that there have been now hundreds of women who claim they made this chicken, and either that night or shortly thereafter, their boyfriends propose. And it's a roast chicken recipe, and, when we were talking about it and talking about sort of the legend of it, I think it just was one of those things that kind of harkens back to that old phrase, nothing says loving like something in the oven. Right. And it's an old school recipe, but it holds up really, really well. It's just a delicious roast chicken, and women call it the engagement chicken. I don't know how many women have been proposed to. It may be in the hundreds. I don't know the exact number.
Well, it doesn't matter. It's I'm up for a roast chicken. I'll be looking up the recipe.
Yes, it's a very good one.
And did you? So, what was the first book? I guess Yes Chef would have been the second one you did with Marcus. Am I right about that?
No, Yes Chef was the first book I did with Marcus. It was the first chef memoir that I did.
Right. Tell me about that experience. How did you connect with him? What made that an interest for you?
Well, Marcus and I had been friends for a long time, since our 20s, and wow. It was one of those things where he really. He'd worked on the book for a long time, actually, with other authors, and then, but then I think at some point he needed some help, and he knew that I knew him, and so it became a question of, okay, I don't really do collaborations. I don't really do memoirs with other people, but can I help you figure out how to tell a story? Yeah, because I've known him for a long time. And so I kind of jumped in and I really was just trying to help. And so much so that my name isn't on the hardcover. They said, you should put your name on this. And I said, you know what? It's his life. It's his book. I don't need my name on this. I have my own book. And then it was a really amazing period where the New York Times called and they said, there's this thank you to Veronica in the acknowledgments. We think she wrote this book. Is it okay if we say that? And I just remember that day walking outside and thinking, wow, I worked so hard on this. I didn't put my name on it, and yet people somehow knew. And they went back and they put my name on the paperback because of that. So,
nice.
And we won a James Beard Award, and we got the New York Times. Like we got it was my first New York Times bestseller, and it just became like the beginning of something new in my life, which shows, I think, that sometimes it pays to help a friend, even if you don't think you're going to get a lot of credit for it.
That's quite the story. What about his story? What was it about his story that? What was the essence of the story that you wanted to convey to the reader? Because he had a very interesting childhood, an interesting life, an interesting movement, a migration, as you would call it. What is it about him?
Right. So I think the thing about Marcus is that his story was super interesting. Born in Ethiopia, raised in Sweden, and then he sort of finds this like ultra home in Harlem. And in some ways it seems really simple, but it was being really complicated because there was a lot of things going on along that journey and that path. And for me, when I walked into the book, I sort of said that I didn't think that the book had to be all things to all people. Mm-hmm. I really thought that the book needed to sort of satisfy four constituents. One, I thought it was parents, particularly mothers who'd adopted kids from foreign lands. Mm-hmm. I mean, you can't walk down the street with Marcus without someone saying, I adopted a baby from XYZ. And the one thing that you know is that he had this mother in Sweden in the 1970s, and both his mother and his father's adopted parents, they did it well. They somehow managed to take both him and his sister, these two Ethiopian kids, and in a completely white suburban suburb of Sweden in the 1970s, and they made them feel entirely at home, mm-hmm. and they made them feel they had agency and power and a sense of place. So I feel like adoptive parents wanted to know some of that story. I felt like there was this first generation new immigrant story that was part of it. And then I thought that the second half of it was kind of split between people who have, and so I felt like if we could somehow construct the book to give a little bit of that story to each of them, then we'd have a decent book. I think that what we ended up with really exceeded our expectations.
Yeah, and I will throw this in at you. He's an interesting guy. I had the chance to meet him and to interview him. He was opening a Marcus restaurant in Bermuda. I'm going back 2 or 3 years. I was invited. Yes. I was invited to the opening, and which was great. I wanted, though, for me the key was to sit down with him, and I can't even begin to tell you how reticent he was to sit down and spend a half an hour with me for an interview, even though I was there literally to cover the opening of his restaurant at the in Hamilton. I forget, it must be like the Princess. And the odd thing, Veronica, is that we have friends in common. So like literally, it wasn't I was coming in, as I was some kind of a journalist with an agenda. We literally had friends in common, and eventually he kind of acquiesced. I sat down with him, and I think, by the way, his reticence was because I feel like at some point he might have been burned in the press related to, the opening of the restaurant in Harlem and whatever the case. But we sat down, had a lovely conversation, and at the end of it, I asked him a question that I ask most anybody, who's in the food business, which is like, what meal do they, what's the meal that they make for the most taste, the fewest ingredients, and the least effort? And whatever the meal was in his case, and I believe it was a piece of fish sprinkled with berbere, I said to him at that point, and I'm going back 3 years or whatever it is, I said, tell me about berbere. And he explained the spice blend to me. And to this day, it is easily not only my favorite, but the spice blend that I use more than anything else. As you and I are on the podcast right now, in my oven is what I call panko crusted buffalo berbere chicken thighs. So I'm still on top of the berbere from that conversation with him.
Yeah, I mean that's a great story. I think the thing though is I think every single person in the public eye is reticent. I don't unless the person is like a born performer and they came to perform. I think that reticence is what I deal with constantly. I mean, I just think that people are protective, and there's just a lot being thrown at them of the 24-hour news cycle and the mix of bloggers and podcasts and Instagrammers, and there's just a lot of people who get to have a little bit of say about you, which makes it really difficult, I think, for sensitive, creative people to connect in any real way.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more, and I think it's particularly true when they're meeting with a quote-unquote journalist, because the journalist oftentimes has an agenda, and in this day and age, part of selling pages or clicks or views or whatever requires a little bit of edginess or controversy or whatever it is that you want to call it. So I totally understand, the reticence, but we overcame that. And by the way, if I forget and it occurs to you, because I want to ask you about, some other things, if we have the chance, I want to come back to you and just talk, because you came out of the magazine publishing business, and I think we should talk at some point, if we have the time, about how that has changed and where that whole thing is going, to the extent that anybody can figure it out. But before we do, Veronica, you do the book with Repair, who I've always said, and I only really shook hands with him for the first time about 2 months ago, but I will tell you what I said to him as someone who's been eating in New York City restaurants since, I'm afraid to admit it, but I guess somewhere around 1970. There's a lot of good restaurants in New York City. Then there are a fewer that are extraordinary, and that place, Le Bernardin, of which he is the executive chef, that's 20 years of extraordinary results. It's like, to me, the hallmark of greatness is the consistency of quality over time, and there's nobody, I think, in America that has done, at least in fish, let's go with that, who has done a better job of kind of excelling in the restaurant business. What he's done there is extraordinary.
He's an extraordinary human being. I mean, I literally feel that's not just a book that I'm proud to have written. It's like a person who I'm privileged to have spent time with.
Yeah.
I mean, I think he is someone who has thought so deeply about life and connection and what we're here for. And I mean, writing that book changed my life.
Wow.
He's an extraordinary human being, and I feel really gifted to have worked with him and Kathy Sherry, who's his director of partnerships. I mean, the two of them, just the whole team, how they do things, Aldo Song, I mean, they're just some of the most unique people, and I didn't think I was going to get that book. Like, when you start to collaborate, it's kind of like 50 First Dates. I could literally list the dozens of people that they call and they say, come in for a meeting. You come in for a meeting and you put on a dress and your nice shoes and you go in and you try to make conversations, and then you find, oh, they've gone in a different way. it's like acting, or they don't think you're friendly enough, or they don't think you're perky, or they don't think you're intellectual enough, or whatever. And then, I go in to meet this like ultra elite front chef, and I'm a Black Latina girl from Brooklyn.
Mm-hmm.
And before I met Marcus, I never had a tasting dinner. I never had. I didn't know what 4-star dining was. I'm very much like a sort of old school, intuitive, home, slightly island influenced cook. And so I went into that meeting, and I really thought I was not the one. And when they called me and offered it to me, I was really surprised. But I have to say, it was just an amazing connection. Eric told the LA Times that I was the best therapist that he ever had. And, I think it was this weird thing where he was sort of ready to be like grilled and kind of go there. And I felt like I understood really early on that his book was as much about masculinity and about humanity and spirituality as it was about food. I mean, I felt that within month one. I was like, oh, the food stuff I'll figure out, but I have to figure out the other stuff first. And so I think we were really well paired in that way.
I saw the when he was interviewed, I believe it was on CBS morning show, and I love that you said that he's not just an exceptional chef, but an extraordinary human being. I mean, he had a difficult childhood.
Yeah.
And you can speak to that, but I think also you talk about his spirituality. I think he's either a Buddhist or he practices Buddhism. He meditates.
Yeah.
I see him walk because I'm in the Central Park periodically, and I see him walk. I've seen him many times walking through the park, going over to the restaurant.
He walks to work every day.
Yeah, it's unbelievable. But a Buddhist, no?
Yes, he's a Buddhist, and one of the things that Eric said to me that I come back to me in waves. Also, he took the time to like teach me meditation, which has sort of changed my life.
Wow.
I mean, not sort of, changed my life in a big way. And but the thing that Eric said to me that was like the game changer is that he said one of the reasons that he hasn't expanded Le Bernardin, if you watch Anthony Bourdain's shows, there's this kind of running joke with them where Anthony's like, you're leaving money on the table. You should have like the Shake Shack equivalent of Le Bernardin and fish and chip shops and a place in the airport. And the reason why he hasn't expanded is because he says a third of his life is for himself and for his spirituality and for his development of himself. And a third of his life is for his family, for his wife and his son and his mother and his extended family. And then a third of his life is for work. And he's really figured out this balance. And he's like, if I add another restaurant to it, I won't be able to maintain that balance.
Unbelievable, yeah.
And I think about that a lot. It's what I feel like I hope I get to in the next, I say 5 years, but realistically I mean 10. I would love to feel like my life felt like a third for work, a third for my family, a third for myself. But I'm not there yet. But it's such a worthy goal to say, this is enough. And this is a balance that gives me everything I can give. And it gives me everything I need. And it is all that I can give to the level that I want to give it. That's pretty exceptional, I think.
I agree with you. And I also would add, and again, this is just me, speculating. I think it would be hard, even though it's been done. You look at guys like Joel Robuchon, and they have multiple, Michelin stars or Michelin stars in multiple restaurants. I think the level that this guy is working at Le Bernardin is such that, I've always believed you can do one thing extraordinarily well, you can do two things pretty well, you can do three things, rather well. But I think, part of the success is the intensity of the focus in the quality that they deliver there, time in and time out. It's still so awesome.
Yeah, and I will say that as someone who had never dined at Le Bernardin before, that it is a place where, like, the consistency is, it's not like, oh, this is, I remember once I was in there with my husband, and we were seated next to these huge executives, like people you've seen on the cover of Forbes and Business Week and all these different things. And the people were so nice equally to, like, my husband and my parents or anyone that I've been with, and as with stars or celebrities. And the whole thing of, like, everyone is here to have an extraordinary experience, and it may be someone's, like, college graduation and they've saved for months to be there.
Right.
Like, they really understand that, like, people come in at different levels, and it's not expense account 5-star dining, which
Right.
is, you know, like it's going on a corporate card and you're going to add 20% and it's done.
Right.
It's really like if you came out with, like, rolls of pennies, you would get the same service. And I think it's what sets them apart. It literally, I've seen it time and time again, that somebody walks in and they think, I'm not fancy enough, or this is the one and done for me of this experience. And they have the time of their lives because the people there are committed to you having the time of your life. And that's pretty special. And I think a lot of New York restaurants do not have that ethos, and the treatment can really vary. And it's part of what is not great sometimes about, like, the bankerization of New York City.
Let me ask you this: since you had this experience with two superstar celebrity chefs, what did you find about them? What did they share? Certain kind of characteristics or similarities?
I think one of the reasons I love writing with chefs is that chefs are, to me, they tend not to be people who are overly educated. You know what I mean? Like, both Marcus and Eric were not great students, and they came to food as part of I love food, and what am I going to do?
Right.
Because I'm not going to get into, like, the A levels of university in Europe. And so there's just humbleness that is really wonderful. And, you know, my agent, Kim Witherspoon, is one of the founders of the Bronx High School of Letters. And every year they have this amazing benefit. And the chefs show up. And it's Marcus, and it's Eric, and it's Anthony Bourdain, and it's Christina Tosi. And you just see these chefs show up for these kids who live in one of the poorest districts in America, one of the most violent districts in America. But chefs get it because there's not a single celebrity chef at that level. And I'm not talking about Food Network because I don't really know that world, but at the, like, level of the James Beard Award, the Michelin stars, everything else, who has said, oh, call me when it's time for my close-up and I will be there. You know, they have all been burned and scalded and carried the heavy pots and, like, worked their way through this brigade system, and they've earned it. And so I've seen them show up for the poorest and the most, like, neglected of New Yorkers and young people, and I love that about them. I just feel like at the end of the day, there's just nothing quite like it, because there's a lot of glamour once you get at a certain level, but getting there is no real shortcut. I don't know anyone who has. And I think that's pretty amazing. There's not a lot of jobs like that left in our culture, where you really have to do the work. You have to roll up your sleeves and you have to make things. I think that's pretty exemplary, and I love that about chefs.
Agree, and I will add in that I went, I would say, 6-8 weeks ago to an event. What I'm commenting on here is their generosity as a group. I went to this event, and I'm guessing it's 6-8 weeks ago. It was chefs, cookies for kids. The point is that they were raising money for pediatric cancer research, and it was not the first year. It was, I think, year 5, and they raised like $5 million just by volunteering their time to cook for a crowd, and really very generous and really super heartwarming event as a group. They're to be to be honored, and you know, it's I'm proud. I think they were kind of great. It was just amazing what they are willing to do to help others.
I completely agree.
Now, speaking about chefs, tell me about Between Harlem and Heaven. Is that out or is it coming out?
It's out. It came out in February. It's done really well. It's by two chefs, Alexander Smalls, who's kind of a legendary New York stalwart. He's had a number of restaurants here in New York, and a young chef named J.J. Johnson, who was one of Esquire's best new chefs in America. And it's their partnership, and it's really about them sort of this cuisine that they created together, this Afro-Asian cuisine, and it's about all the ways in which the African diaspora and the Asian diaspora crisscross all across the globe, and how rice is sort of the central part of that, but all these flavor patterns that like overlap and intersect and influence each other. It's a really beautiful, fun book.
Tell people also, because you can, tell people also who are listening about Harlem. I'm asking you that as a guy who I would say I am a 4-minute walk right now from where I'm sitting. I am a 4-minute walk from being there. But tell people about Harlem.
Harlem is amazing. I mean, Harlem has always been, for me, I think, a legendary place. I grew up reading about the Harlem Renaissance, about the 1920s. There was a famous saying in the 1920s when African Americans first started to move to Harlem that I'd rather be a lamppost in Harlem than mayor of Georgia. And it's always been a place of amazing culture, diversity, integration. You know, basically, Alexander Hamilton lived in Harlem.
Yeah.
You know, like it's been, you know, when you go to see the musical Hamilton and they say it's quiet uptown and Eliza sings that song, they're talking about Harlem and the greater, you know, Harlem and the greater environs. And I just think it's such a special place. You know, Gucci has just opened its first like landmark store with a legendary Harlem tailor named Dapper Dan.
Wow. The
Studio Museum of Harlem has become one of the most important museums in the world. Of course, Red Rooster, Marcus's restaurant, is in Harlem, but there's also just a great history of music and dance and really people connecting with each other. And that's why I think that book, Between Harlem and Heaven, it's one of the few places where you really get this sense of New York at the edges of what not New York and not like I'm going to take a picture of the Empire State Building, Rockefeller Center, you know, not the clips show New York, but really like people on the streets living their lives. There's a beautiful architecture up there. There's art, there's music, there's architecture, there's food. There's just life teeming in Harlem. And I think it's really special.
I am with you, and I am with you. I agree, and I am a fan. In the short time that we have left, Veronica, do you do some cooking yourself?
I do. It's funny because you know my husband Jason Clampett, and we used to try to cook together. But we do not cook amazingly well together. He is much more the short-ordered dad. Like, he's a guy who could get dinner on the table in 15 minutes.
Right.
I'm the person who likes to make big elaborate meals. I'm like, let's order in the lobster, or let's do this, you know, ingredient and this thing. And I like to plan, and I don't know, I'm kind of a dinner party cook. And though he does make a mean bosom. So,
I mean, what?
So, bosom,
oh, okay, yeah.
It's like the roast pork, like the 12-hour roast pork, and I do some of the sides, and so yeah, we figure it out, but we're not often in the kitchen together. It's usually one of us cooking and the other one, sort of pulled up and talking and cut.
Yeah, I hear you. And then my final question for you: what do you know for sure?
what I know for sure
Yeah.
is that stories matter, that meals, that we're telling a story on the table every day, and that as tired and exhausted and overwhelmed as we are, that it really matters to try to make the things we put on the table in front of ourselves and our family really count and really say something about how we live. Because I think it was Andy Dillard who said how we spend our days is how we spend our lives, and I think how we eat throughout the days is how we spend our lives. So I think food matters.
Well, I want to thank you first of all. They just gave me the the 1 minute wrap up, and I want to thank you because it's a pleasure to speak with you. Your work is outstanding and speaks for itself. For anybody that wants to find you, veronicachambers.com or VV Chambers in the social media space. Again, I thank you for being here. And I will tell everyone else who is listening at this point that, again, it's a treat to be here. This was episode number 11, All You Can Eat. We're back next Wednesday night at 8 p.m. Eastern Time, so join us there. And then next week, I don't know if we're going to do a guest, but we have Mr. Coleman Andrews coming on the week after, and there aren't many people that know more about food in this country or in this world than Coleman. And so, again, thank you, Veronica Chambers, for tonight. Just a treat to be with you. And ladies and gentlemen, remember that life is short, so never waste a meal. Good night.
I'm the Teflon Pan Man. I'm the Teflon Pan Man. Ain't nothing gonna stick on